The name alone is enough to send chills down your spine. The rat torture of ancient China. But behind the whispers of this punishment lies something far darker than most people imagine. This wasn't just a crude method of intimidation or some bizarre superstition. This was an execution technique designed with precision, with the cold, calculating intention to break the victim's body and mind before death ever came. The story you're about to hear is not simply about a method, it is about a man. His name was Lee Wei, a minor government clerk in the late Ming Dynasty. By all accounts, Lee was an honest worker, but one unlucky decision placed him in the crosshairs of a local magistrate who had the emperor's ear. He was accused of embezzling grain taxes, a charge that, in those days, was as good as a death sentence. But in this case, they didn't want him to just die. They wanted him to serve as a lesson, a warning etched into the minds of anyone who might consider crossing the state. On the day of his arrest, soldiers burst into Liu's modest home before sunrise. His wife screamed as he was dragged from bed, still in his night clothes. The magistrate had already decided his fate. A quick beheading would be too merciful. The rat torture was chosen. To understand why this method was so feared, you need to picture it. The prisoner would be bound, usually on a flat table or against a wooden board. A large clay or metal pot, its rim wide enough to fit snugly against the victim's skin, would be placed over a section of the body. The choice of location varied, sometimes the belly, sometimes the chest, sometimes even the face. Inside the pot live hungry rats, but it wasn't enough to simply let the rats scurry around. The executioners knew that an animal trapped in darkness with no escape would claw and gnaw, but only under extreme duress. So they applied heat. Hot coals, embers, or burning charcoal would be placed on top of the pot. The rising temperature would create unbearable conditions inside. The rats, desperate to escape the heat, would dig in the only direction they could, downward, into the flesh of the victim. For Lee Wei, the choice of placement was his abdomen. His hands and feet were tied so tightly that the rope cut into his skin. His shirt was ripped open, exposing his pale stomach. He could see the writhing forms of the rats as they were dumped into the pot. Long tails, twitching noses, beady black eyes catching the dim light of the torches. Then the pot was pressed firmly against him and sealed at the edges with clay to trap the creatures inside. The moment the hot embers were placed on the pot's top, Liu began to thrash. At first, it was just heat. Unbearable, yes, but not yet the worst. The real horror began when the rats, frantic from the growing temperature, started to dig. Their claws raked across his skin. Their teeth tore at the first layers of flesh. The sound, a muffled, scratching frenzy, was enough to make the onlookers turn pale. This was not a quick death. The magistrate, sitting in a tall chair, watched with no emotion as the executioner stoked the coals to keep the pot at a steady, hellish heat. Liu's screams shifted from loud cries to broken gasps. His muscles strained against the ropes, but there was no escape. Blood began to seep from under the pot's edges, dark and sticky. The rats, smelling it, became more frenzied. Liu's mind began to shatter long before his body gave out. In Chinese records, this punishment was sometimes used as an interrogation method. The victim would confess anything, true or not, to make it stop. But in Liu's case, there was nothing to confess. He had already been condemned. His suffering was the confession, the trial, and the sentence all in one. Eyewitnesses later described the smell, a sickening mix of burning clay, scorched flesh, and something animalistic. Some turned away, pressing sleeves to their faces. Others watched, because that was the point. Fear was the currency of power, and this was how it was minted. After what felt like hours, Liu stopped screaming. The magistrate nodded, and the executioners removed the pot. The rats, their snouts red, scattered into the shadows. What remained of Liu was barely recognizable. His abdomen was a ruin of torn muscle and exposed bone. He was still alive, barely, his eyes glassy and unfocused. Death came minutes later, but not before he took one last, shuddering breath. The rat torture was rare, not because of mercy, but because of its difficulty. It required live animals, controlled heat, and a willingness to witness the kind of suffering that could haunt even the hardest soldier. In many ways, that's what made it so effective. It wasn't just about killing someone. It was about making sure everyone who heard about it or saw it carried that fear with them for the rest of their lives. And 4 years after Lee Wei's death, his name was whispered in the markets and tea houses of the city. Parents told their children to be honest, to obey, because otherwise, the rats will come. In the minds of the people, the magistrate's lesson had worked. The body was gone, but the terror lingered like a shadow that could never be burned away. Lee Wei's execution was not the first time the rat torture had been used in China, but it became one of the most infamous in his province. Rumors spread quickly. Some claimed the rats had burrowed so deep they had reached his intestines before death claimed him. Others whispered that he had tried to bite through his own tongue to end the pain, but failed. In truth, few knew the exact details, but the human imagination, when paired with fear, rarely needs help to create nightmares. In the weeks that followed, the magistrate's reputation soared, not in kindness, but in power. People came to understand that this was a man who would not hesitate to make an example of anyone. Traders paid their taxes on time. Petty thieves seemed to vanish overnight. Even the local gangs kept a lower profile. It wasn't the soldiers they feared. It was the rats. The origins of rat torture in China are difficult to pin down, but historians believe it may have roots stretching back to the Han Dynasty. While it wasn't a standard method of execution, it appeared sporadically in records, often in times of political unrest when fear was more valuable than justice. Rats were plentiful in cities and villages, thriving in the shadows of granaries, markets, and waste pits. They were hated by the people, carriers of disease, destroyers of crops, but in the hands of an executioner, they became the perfect living weapon. One of the earliest documented uses comes from an account. During the Three Kingdoms period, a captured spy, refusing to name his co-conspirators, was subjected to a crude form of rat torture. The story says he lasted less than an hour before revealing every name, location, and plan in his network. Whether this account is exaggerated or not, it reveals the psychological potency of the method. The thought of being gnawed alive from the inside was often enough to make the strongest will collapse. In Lee Wei's case, there was no such confession. His silence was not bravery, it was resignation. The injustice of his situation had broken him before the rats ever touched him. That morning, before his arrest, he had shared breakfast with his wife and young son. They had no idea it would be the last time. Witnesses later recalled seeing his family watching from a distance, their faces pale, as the pot was placed on him. They were forbidden to intervene, forbidden even to cry out. That was part of the ritual humiliation, to destroy not only the body, but the spirit of those connected to it. The magistrate's court records, preserved in brittle scrolls, detail the expenses for the execution, the payment to the animal catcher for the live rats, the purchase of the clay sealing mixture, and the cost of the charcoal. The total was meager compared to other executions. This was another reason such punishments appealed to corrupt officials. They were terrifying, yet cheap to carry out. The psychological torment of rat torture often began long before the physical act. Prisoners would be told in detail what would happen to them, shown the rats in their cages, even made to hear the scratching noises in the dead of night. Some would break down before the first claw ever touched them. The fear alone could reduce a proud man to begging on his knees. Even centuries later, Chinese folk tales and cautionary stories carried echoes of this punishment. In some rural areas, parents would frighten disobedient children by telling them that bad boys are fed to the rats. The historical truth blurred with legend, but the core of it remained the same. Rats were not only vermin, they were instruments of human cruelty. What makes the rat torture so uniquely horrifying is its blend of nature and human malice. This was not a clean execution. nor was it entirely under the executioner's control. Rats are unpredictable. They panic, they bite at random, and once the heat drives them into a frenzy, they stop being animals and become pure survival instinct with teeth. That chaos is what made the torture so effective and so feared. As for Lee Wei's family, their lives were shattered. His wife, stripped of her husband's position and shamed by association, was forced to leave the city. His son grew up under a false name, always afraid that someone might connect him to the man who had died under the pot. Years later, when asked about his father, he would simply say, "He died for nothing." The rat torture eventually faded from official records, replaced by more standardized methods like beheading or strangulation. But in times of rebellion or during secret interrogations, whispers say it was revived, always in the shadows, always without the emperor's official blessing. The last rumored case comes from the late 19th century, when a suspected bandit leader was said to have been executed in this way by a provincial warlord. The details were never confirmed, but once again, they didn't need to be. Fear has a way of surviving without proof. Lee Wei's story stands as a reminder that the cruelty of history isn't always about the scale of violence. Sometimes, it's about the intimacy of it. One man, bound and helpless, feeling the desperate claws of an animal tearing through him while others watch in silence. It's a kind of death that leaves no heroism, no dignity, only a legacy of terror. And that's the true horror of the rat torture. Not just the pain, but the knowledge that it was designed not for justice, but for domination. The victim's body became a message carved into living flesh. This is what happens when you defy us. Centuries may have passed since Lee Wei's death, but his fate still lingers like a ghost in the darker corners of history. The rats are gone, the pots are cold, but the fear remains, because some punishments are never truly buried. They live on in the stories we tell, the warnings we whisper, and the nightmares we can't unhear.